Welcome to episode 44 of OT Conversations That Matter, the podcast. I'm your host, Justine Jecker, and pleased to welcome back a former host of the podcast and occupational therapist, Holly Reid, to talk about collaborative, relationship-focused occupational therapy and what it means. Holly is a PhD candidate doing community-based research in partnership with two Indigenous-led organizations in British Columbia. After more than 2 years of ongoing consultations and relationship building, this research study explores 2S LGBTQIA+ Indigenous peoples' ways of knowing, being, and doing through occupation. Holly is also a new business owner, recently starting Euphoria Consulting, spelled Y-O-Euphoria, where they support staff, leaders, managers, healthcare workers, and non-healthcare oriented workplaces in creating and upholding an environment where folks who are 2S LGBTQ+ can thrive as they are meant to. Today's topic, collaborative relationship-focused occupational therapy, refers to an approach that focuses on relational aspects of the therapist, individuals, and collectives. Specifically, there are 4 components supporting this concept in the Promoting Occupational Participation textbook. First, contextually relevant relationships. This means the OT/OTA must recognize and address the forces that facilitate or constrain relationship building, including working on their self to enhance self-awareness and its impact on relationships. Secondly, nuanced relationships. There is a difference between building a relationship with an individual and a community. Each relationship can be developed over varying periods of time and in various circumstances. Thirdly, safety in relationships. OTs and OTAs need to be aware of all forms of harm that could be inflicted on individuals and communities. We need to be aware of and implement trauma-informed principles in our practices and identify policies and structures that create trauma in the first place, as well as act to change these forces through advocacy. Lastly, promoting rights-based self-determination. This means demonstrating an attitude for the respect of rights, strengths, and resources of peoples and communities, acceptance of varying worldviews, and creating many opportunities for collaborations. Welcome to the podcast, Holly. After almost 3 years, it's so awesome to have you.
Thanks, Justine. It's so exciting to think back to when we started this podcast in 2021, which now feels so long ago, and so much has changed, but it's been great to stay in relationship with you, actually, as we've kind of gone through these different paths and everything. So thank you so much for inviting me back. It's so exciting to be here.
I know, I almost didn't let you go. You tried to leave the for like 6, 7, 8 months, and I kept finding ways to make you stay on longer.
Yeah, it was hard to go because we just had so much exciting work that we were doing, and that you and Emily now have continued and everything. So it's been so wonderful to see it grow, and hard to move on and do other things, but seem to keep finding my way back, even when it's an invite for the podcast. So.
I love it. And I love that even before getting into the depth of relationship-focused occupational therapy, I feel like the podcast in and of itself is just an incredible medium for relationship building. Like I just can't imagine what my world would have been like without the podcast that, thanks to you, was launched 3 years ago. So I just want to say that I think that it's just so serendipitous to be having this conversation with you today after 3 years of, all the relationships, 44 episodes of relationship building that we've done.
Definitely, yeah. And I think that even extends to the people who've listened and the relationship they've come into with the ideas that have been talked about. So I'm really excited to talk about this today because I think relationships extend so far beyond just person to person, and its ideas, its occupations, its spaces that we're doing things in. To me, relationships are everything. So I'm really excited to get into it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to start, because even the word relationship, I was really reflecting, leading up to this podcast. When did I first hear that word, in occupational therapy school specifically? Like, when did that kind of first come about in my mind? And And then, now for me, 15 years later, what has that evolution looked like? And you've been in practice a little bit less than I have, a lot less. But I kind of want to start there with the journey of even the term relationship without, we did a bit of an intro in the podcast in terms of how it's defined, but let's just start first with the word relationship. When did you first come in contact with it?
I think in the context of occupational therapy, I remember learning a lot about rapport. And I had come from a kinesiology background where it was very like science, physical. A person is kind of all these components of the human body. There wasn't really a focus on the person, like the personality behind all of these really cool things our body can do. And so heading into OT school, I started in 2017, just for a bit of time context. I remember learning a lot about rapport building and how to go about that. And then this concept of therapeutic use of self. And I remember thinking like, oh, well, okay, that's about how I'm showing up in relationship with another person is like, am I using myself in a therapeutic way with what I disclose about myself to let them know a little bit about who I am, but not everything because I need to protect my own personal boundaries. So that's where I really started to first learn about it. I think it was in our first term, we were just learning these different theoretical concepts, and therapeutic use of self was taught as a theoretical concept, which then I really started to feel and understand more when I was doing my fieldwork placements, because that's where I would see disclosure happening, or I would get asked personal questions and think about what's the impact on the relationship here if I answer or if I don't answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting. It's an intimate word, right? Relationship, to be in relation with. I think it's taken us time in the profession to get to this point where we can comfortably use that word, because I agree the training for me was definitely on rapport, on this idea of building rapport with clients, which is another concept we'll get into shortly, but even the evolution away from client-centered care towards this idea of relationship-focused occupational therapy, they're really connected. And you can't really, if you're servicing a client, that becomes a very transaction-focused relationship. It's a commodity as opposed to really building this kind of connection with another human being or another group of individuals, and evolving from there. And I think it's an interesting, I really imagine, especially for our younger OTs and student OTs that are still in the process, this concept is deep because in the opening definition, it talks about you have to do the work within you first, right? Before you can come to the table prepared to build a relationship. Can you comment on that a little bit? Like, what was that like in your schooling in terms of doing work within yourself to be able to bring kind of the best therapeutic self forward?
Yeah, it's a great question because I had a lot going on while I was doing my master's in terms of my own identity journey to begin with. And then with that, also the identity journey of becoming an occupational therapist and what shape I wanted that to take for myself. Because I think we don't all need to become the exact same OT. We need to do it in a way that makes sense for us. But with that comes the relationship with ourselves. So we were expected to do reflections when we were on fieldwork placement, which I think was a fantastic way to really think about how we showed up with our clients, what we would do differently. But a lot of it for me was how it felt. So I'm a big feeler. And so I kind of operate in the world based off of how I feel in relationship to where I am, who I'm with, but also most importantly, I think with myself first, because if I don't feel good here, I can't show up my best self for others or with others. And so I remember learning a lot about that on placement, even in relationship with my preceptor, who was kind of modeling and showing me different ways of being an OT. My relationship with them would influence my relationship with the client and kind of that three-way relationship as well. So I remember writing the reflective journals and just being like writing pages. They were supposed to be like maybe 500 words, and I would write really long entries because I had a lot to really process and work through. So I do remember that. And then in class, it would be, chat with the person next to you about how this concept fits into your life. Or I think a lot of that processing was done with other people, but the individual processing, I think, is important as well of how am I in relationship with myself and how is that influencing how I then show up with and for others?
Yeah, absolutely. Relationship with self is it's so huge, and it's kind of been a theme on the podcast, I would say, this year. We had a podcast looking at trauma-informed care and others looking at a person's experiencing occupation in correctional facilities, and this idea of the therapist being able to be their best self, to be able to support others in their journey. I I want to comment that for this podcast, so we've introduced the idea of collaborative relationship focused OT, and we're also just using kind of shortened relationship focused occupational therapy. I think that for the purposes of this discussion, that we're really talking about the same thing. We're talking about being in relationship. For me, inherently, if you're in relationship in the true sense, I think it is a collaboration. I don't really think perhaps you can have a one-sided relationship, but just in case listeners are wondering, about the terms we're using. One of the things that came to mind for me in preparing, I remember we were chatting about this podcast, Holly, was this idea. It really stuck with me about how people can engage in occupation when the relationships are not in a good place. Not necessarily with the therapist in front of them, but how many times have we shown up to maybe a meeting or an encounter or a planned appointment, and our headspace really isn't in the right place because there's something going on with relationships that we have in our personal life, whether it's with our partners or our family, or maybe another individual we saw just before meeting the person we're meeting now. And I wanted to touch on that a little bit further before going deeper into relationship focused OT, but this idea that we're in relationship with multiple people at any given time, and how that can be influencing the dynamic of the person in front of you, even before getting into occupation.
For sure. Yeah. I think, again, that's an interesting point because, as you said, we're in a relationship with so many different people in our life. And I think at the point where I'm at now, I think about relationships different than I used to. It used to be relationship was the word I'd use kind of like just romantically. But now I see every person that I meet, that I come into connection with, even if it's a very short interaction, like there is a relationship there, even if it's brief, if it's just for the purpose of a conversation, I never see that person again. I've been changed by that interaction, and so have they. And it's going to influence then potentially the rest of that day or how I do something in the future. And so I think there are changes that happen based off of who we're coming into relationship with and how that's going. And of course, it can influence us positively or negatively. I don't know about neutrally. I don't know if I've ever been kind of not influenced by a relationship. And it's really hard to process that while trying to show up in a different way in a different group of people. So if
Mm-hmm.
things at home are really tough, it's hard to go to work and just leave that at the door and all of a sudden be your best self. And I think you mentioned that as therapists, we do try to show up as our best self, all the time. And that's a lot of pressure for us. And, we can get to burnout and things like that, which is a different topic. But I just wanted to touch on the fact that showing up as our best self doesn't mean ignoring, the realities of what's going on or having to be in a good mood all of the time. I think when we're trying to be our best self, it's about honoring, maybe I need a mental health day and I actually am just not able to show up that day at all. Like it's about honoring kind of what is going on for us and thinking about the potential impact that is going to have on the people who we are in relationship with. Because as you said, it's transactional. It's not like I'm not going to influence the people I'm in relationship with as much as they're influencing me. So I think being aware of that is being our best self.
Yeah, I love that. It's, in that it's that certain degree of humility, right? When you show up to work with a person or a group of persons or a community, that you can kind of be honest and genuine in your interaction, right? And I think when you are in relationship, they can begin to feel you as you begin to feel them. So you're not, if you show up and you're not having the best day, it's felt even if you don't say it out loud. And I think that that's a very unique, this is where it gets really new for me. Like, I'll be honest, like in my training, this is where I think many OTs are starting to try and navigate this new concept of being in relationship with those you're working with. Because we were kind of taught about, transference, countertransference, the idea of, how you're impacting the individual in front of you. When do you cross that line, right? I know that there's a legitimate, I don't know that it's a struggle, but I think there's honest questions around how honest is too open, or to, perhaps getting too close to the person you're serving as a professional or working with. And so it brings me to the next question around, can you do occupational therapy that isn't relationship focused based on what you understand in relationships? I mean, we've labeled it as a thing, but is it possible to do it without being relationship focused?
I think yes. I think we can do anything that in a way that isn't relationship focused. There will still be relationship happening, because I don't know if that would be possible. That's probably getting way too philosophical. So I think, to answer your question, yes, but my question would then be, what is the focus? It used to be a lot more on like client-centered care. I heard that a lot earlier on. And now hearing this language around relationship and collaboration. So if the therapist isn't centering relationship, they might be centering more in line with the medical model. So centering on performance or
Yeah.
Objective outcomes. And like that can become the center of the relationship, rather than the relationship itself actually being such an impactful therapeutic tool. And I've seen the difference for sure. I've also felt the difference as a client, like as someone who accesses healthcare. I think we can feel the difference when it's about the objective findings versus when there's a check-in about the relationship or there's different rapport. So I think both can happen. It's just a matter of why we would want to center a relationship versus why we would want to center other factors that would influence the client in different ways, I think.
Yeah, and you raise a really good point on the use of language. So with the Enabling 1 and Enabling 2 textbooks in Canada, occupational performance is center to the thinking, and so is the language around client-centered care. You start to see the evolution of person-centered care, but it's really focused on the client at that time. And, fast forward to 2.5, 3 years ago, we also have a new textbook released, Promoting Occupational Participation. And then there's now this connection between relationship and occupational participation, right? And I really like how you shared that there is a time and place for both, because in talking to everyday therapists, I can definitely see through the practice inquiries that there is at times very much a performance aspect. So I think of those working in insurance. It's a really easy example to say, yeah, there's a performative component. It doesn't mean they wouldn't be in a relationship with that person that they're serving, but certainly there is there's a means to an end, right? So the relationship is there, it's happening, but there are clear objectives that have to be met. And this is where I'm internalizing. So that's where I love to get feedback from listeners on the podcast. But I think with the relationship focused piece, you may not be entirely sure what the end product is. And I'm curious, in either your research or consulting work, if you're seeing that, is that true? Is it like you may not know the outcome if it's relationship focused, because really the relationship is the driving force?
Definitely. And that's been something that I think time and experience has helped me become comfortable with. At first, coming out of school and especially going through school, I had this agenda of things I knew I wanted to get done, things that I knew I wanted the outcomes to be. And now it's more of, I don't actually know. Like, I
Yeah.
don't have the answers, because the person I'm coming into a relationship with might have different questions than the ones I'm asking. So I can't preload or pre-prep. I can't prepare for questions that I don't actually know yet. And so both in the research that I'm doing with community, I spent, I guess, 2.5 years now building relationships with community members to co-create my PhD study, because the questions that I ask might be completely different than what they actually want answers to. And so
Yeah.
I focused on the relationship, and the questions would come later, and then so would the answers. And then in my consulting work, I center the relationship, because there's so much nuance of what that specific workplace is dealing with in terms of challenges, what their clientele are asking for. that I can't possibly come in thinking I know anything or everything. And I just trust that I'll have some information and some context to offer them that will be what they're looking for. So it's more of trusting this process and using relationship building to get to the collaborative answers
Mhm.
that satisfy everybody, or most people. You can't really ever satisfy everybody, but really being more effective by just trusting that process and showing up just very honest, transparent, using communication. And when I don't know, just saying like, I don't know, but let's figure it out together. I said that with clients when I was practicing as well. Like, oh, actually, I don't know the answer to that. Asking them for more information and then figuring it out together. And the relationship is what's going to be the consistent, like the foundation of that work is like nobody's going to have all the answers.
I love that. And I love, where you come from because you come from the lived experience. So not only in your research, but experiencing it as having Indigenous background and experiencing it in terms of like a life in like worldview. I think when this book was coming together, we had authors of Indigenous backgrounds support promoting occupational participation and the new concept of collaborative relationship focused OT. And I think that it's interesting to me because for Indigenous persons and their ways of knowing, I don't want to say it is second nature. I don't want to make assumptions, but I think it's built into Indigenous ways of knowing naturally that you build relationships from what I experienced working in Northwestern Ontario. And it's interesting to see it now kind of in the more Western lens of schooling and academia, that this is a new concept, right? So it's new to some people, but I think it's safe to say it's certainly not new to Indigenous persons of Canada. This idea that you need to be in relationship with people and with the land, which I want to go there for a second about the land conversation, because I do feel that that might be an element in the book that wasn't emphasized enough. And I do want to listen to, not everybody has read this textbook. Most people have read a chapter or two. They may or may not recognize the new acronym COTIP for the new framework, the CPPF. But I think like, if you didn't read the whole book, that's okay. But I think there is a piece for me that was missing in terms of the relationship to the land. And I'm wondering if you can comment on how you've evolved with that piece as an OT and what that means in the relationship with individuals.
Yeah, I think coming out of school, I remember thinking about like, wow, like the environment really does influence what I do and how I do it. And thinking about I think it was like the four components of the environment being physical, social, cultural, and institutional. And I remember kind of even sitting down and writing out what my influential factors were under each of those or what environments I was in. And it's really shifted now as I've learned about intersectionality theory and integrated that into my research. I've gone on this journey of understanding systems differently. But speaking about my connection to the land, I feel as though that's been a journey that I've kind of taken like as a side, as a parallel journey to my journey as an occupational therapist and a student and many other identities that I have, where it's a place where I go to feel grounded and to further the connection with myself. Or the occupations that I've become interested in have been largely on the land. And so it's something that's kind of happened for me over the past couple of years specifically. I've always loved being outside. I grew up camping. My grandpa, who was the Métis connection in our family, like raised us to know how to fish and hunt, and being in connection with the land was important to him. And so it just kind of became who I am. But now making it more explicit, I spent this summer for the first time growing as much of my own food as I can. And I don't think I've ever felt as like nourished just by having hands in the dirt. I grew a cantaloupe, and I don't know why I've just been like the most excited ever, because I feel like I'm connecting to the land and it's nourishing me back. And so it's extended to when I go hiking and I see trash on the trail, I'm going to pick it up because I feel accountable to my relationship to the community that I'm in, which includes the land that I'm on, which is why I wanted to include this background. I live right
I
next
love that.
it's so nice. Hey, I took it at sunset, and I live on Wasanich territory right next to the Seacom community. And so me not being of that community, my family comes from Red River. I have a responsibility here to show up in relationship with the land and the community in a way that makes me a good guest here. And so I've
Mhm.
kind of really come to that way of thinking about it just over time.
Oh my goodness. And for those who might not be watching the YouTube channel, Holly's background is epic. Just this glorious sunset, this beautiful, is that a jack pine? What kind of pine? I'm not quite sure, but
I'm
just
not actually sure. I can't remember what kind of tree that was, but
water. It's kind of one of those mirroring images of the sky on the water. Just stunning. And I really appreciate you sharing that. And it's interesting that for you it was this parallel experience until more recently, where now it's coming together. Um, because I do feel it's interesting to say environment and land. Even as you were talking, I was thinking of that because it's like, oh yeah, of course we have the four known areas of the environment, traditionally speaking, anyways, and OT lingo. But when you say land, it is a very, you think of climate change, you think of what's growing out of the earth, you think of the connection to animals, right? It's really going beyond just one human being to another or a group of human beings, but to all living things. And yeah, and I think I love, I guess I love the spectrum of what you can be in relationship with and the opportunities that if you're working in different areas of practice, maybe you aren't as in contact with individuals if you're working in a non-clinical setting, for example. But what are other things you're in relationship with that are around you, and how is that influencing your practice? So um, yeah, I love that reflection. One of my questions was going to be, what kind of relational protocols could be used that are different between individual and community? So we said that as one of the consideration, the nuanced relationships, that it's not necessarily the same approach when you're with an individual building a relationship versus a community. I'm wondering, you can pull from anything. You can pull from your clinical or your research experience. What approach have you taken to kind of build the two?
hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because when you say the word protocol, it makes me think mostly my engagement with Indigenous folks because we use that word a lot. What's the protocol in this space, in this ceremony? And really in those contexts, and I think even in non-Indigenous contexts, if we're talking about protocol, what we're talking about is what's the expectation, what's the etiquette, what is being asked of me in showing up in this relationship. So individual, if I'm showing up with somebody, I might adhere or try to prescribe to some of the social norms of how we have a conversation in English, Western. Well, I'm in BC, but like there's certain ways that we interact with each other. And then somebody of a different culture, of a different background, does that process differently, maybe. And so, how am I showing up respecting the way that they do things? Individually, it can be a little bit easier at times to figure that out. You can even like ask somebody about how they want you to show up, or do you like a little bit less eye contact? Like I've had those specific types of conversations to make sure the other person feels comfortable with the relationship and how it's being developed, because I don't want to come in with all my expectations of what a relationship looks like because the other person might not be meeting me there. And so how am I as the OT or the researcher or whoever going to meet somebody where they're at? And we use that language in OT quite a bit, meeting people where they're at. So there's like the kind of micro nuances. And then I think coming into a relationship with community, for me, in my research, when I get together with folks for, say, the sharing circles or the art circles that I'm doing as two of my methods, the other two are individual methods. These ones involve maybe 6 or so people sitting in circle. And at the very start, I always ask the question, how are we going to make this space feel comfortable and safe for all of us to contribute? We call it our community agreements. So for those 2 hours, what are our community agreements? And we're essentially setting a protocol. I just don't necessarily call it that because not
Yeah.
everybody uses that language. So it really does depend on who I'm with, where we are, what we're doing, the occupations that we're talking about. There's so many factors, but I kind of just, I've always called myself a bit of a chameleon. I try to just
Yeah.
become like what the space and the situation needs of me. And I think that's kind of how I try and adhere to protocols is just respecting, yeah, what's being asked of me. How am I here to serve? What am I getting from this? What am I contributing to this?
Yeah, I love that. And you brought me back to my days of doing group therapy. Like I'm it's just wow, it's so unique when you enter that group space, you are immediately responsible not only for the relationship, it's not just the prong spoke model where it's you and connecting with all the individuals in the circle, but all the relationships that are happening within the circle are a part of that experience. And you can only, and this is where it gets really interesting in terms of what we talked about before in terms of performance outcomes or participation outcomes. Like if I'm thinking with a performance lens on in a group, let's say we have a group of 6 people, we have 45 minutes. We're focusing on, I don't know, smoking cessation or looking at maybe changing a specific behavior and supporting the group through that. You really know by the end of that session that the individuals are going to either share or demonstrate a certain level of learning based on what's discussed in the group. I think when you come at it with an occupational participation lens, with the relationship focused piece, you go in there thinking, okay, well, smoking cessation is super important for the individuals here. They want to, improve their health in different ways. But once the conversations get going, you really just don't know where it can bring you in terms of, is it really about smoking cessation? Is there really something else, were they just told to go to this group because that's where they were referred to by their family doctor or maybe a social worker? Or is this, is there a bigger conversation really happening? And I think it's through the relationship that you find out, like, why are people here? What is this really about? I remember I would do groups that would start off, I love this. We would start off with an icebreaker, and that would be the 45-minute session. Like, yeah, we wouldn't get past the icebreaker because the icebreaker was so powerful and so engaged. And usually we did it to, like, as true icebreakers do, get people laughing, feeling more relaxed. And then it would lead to an honest question, usually posed not by myself, but by someone else in the group who would say, well, Jack, why did you do that? Like, what were you thinking when you did that? And it would take on its own experience, right? And I think that it's just interesting to be aware of that. I think as an OT or an OTA in that setting is just, okay, what lens am I going to take on? Is it okay that we're not going to achieve the outcome that we were hoping or whatever? It was pre-planned, like you said. And I think I love the protocol or whatever term is used to really set the rules of engagement to say, this is why we've come here today, because I think that ultimately that's the driving force. And I know that the least talking that I'm doing as a therapist, the better, right? So if the relationship is fueling itself in the group and you're kind of there making sure that you're kind of facilitating, making sure someone gets their word in, or you're reading if maybe the conversation is not going in the best direction, you can help like get it going in a different direction. It's knowing when to let go as a therapist of your own focus and letting the relationship just be the focus.
Yeah, and I think what you just shared in like that kind of group therapy example is such a good example of when the relationship can actually be the therapy. Because if folks show up and yes, maybe their family doctor or someone has referred them to be there, you can tell them all the facts in the world about smoking.
Mhm.
Acting on that may or may not be something that they're going to do. However, if they show up and it's not about the facts, it's that they feel heard, they feel validated, they see other people with a shared experience, that might be all the motivation they need to be like, actually, you know what? I'm ready to do this for myself. Meanwhile, you didn't have to teach them anything specifically about not smoking anymore or whatever the behavior change is. Sometimes all people need is to come into connection with another person to actually make the changes happen, because most people know how to do what they're being told what to do. Like people are very smart. They can come up with a lot of solutions or have answers. They can look up answers on the internet. Sometimes the requirement is a relationship to be the container for then the work to take place within, essentially.
Yeah, and I'm gonna pick up on that and go a step further with another kind of synonym, another relatable word. Relatable is the word actually. Relatable from relationship, but It's interesting, and anybody who's worked in northern rural Indigenous communities with persons of color or different background, immigrants to Canada, you know that when you're within that environment working with those individuals, that there is a relatability factor. And I think you cannot be really in relationship if the persons in front of you do not feel that they can relate to you. And that's been a huge issue with colonization, with Western ways of thinking and worldviews, with all the titles that we have after our names. And I think that is a shift in the profession that I'm seeing, is this idea that, I remember my very first day of working in forensic mental health, and the dress code is very specific in terms of what you need to wear. And that's because it doesn't tell you in the policy, it makes it kind of sugarcoats what it's really saying, but it's really about being able to relate to the individuals that you're working with. And I'm wondering if you experienced, Holly, anything in your journey where you ever felt like, okay, I'm not relating, maybe based on the way I'm presenting or something I've said, or maybe even my education that I'm bringing to the table is maybe creating a barrier or not allowing for that relatability to happen. I'm curious, is there something coming to mind for you?
Yeah, I think for me, what comes to mind is how much I bought into or really tried to have that white professionalism where I would wear like dress clothes, and I still really like matching my dress shirts to my dress socks at conferences and things like that. But I think now that's more of like a fun thing that I do. But as an OT student and a new grad, what I was trying to do was feel more confident, and I really just think that I came across in a way that the clients saw me not necessarily as like relaxed and relatable, because showing up dressed a little bit more like casually, using language that the clients, they're using too, that took a while for me to figure out out of school. And so working in the hospital helped because I would dress more casually there. And clients would use certain words and certain language that then I would mirror back. And from there, I was like, oh, relationships are a lot easier when you truly do kind of put aside my own insecurities. Like, I don't need to
Yeah.
dress a certain way to become more confident. I just need to show up and do the job that I've been trained to do. And so a lot of it was just confidence building. And that's where I think earlier we were talking about doing our own personal work is really important. Because if I didn't reflect on, like, well, why do I feel like I need to dress up? Why do I feel like I need to appear smarter than maybe I think I would if I dressed a certain way? There was a lot of biases that I had that now I'm like, okay, I would approach these situations differently, and the relationship would then be different as a result. So
Yeah, and I think what's unique, going back to your chameleon analogy, is with different individuals, you might need to change with the different generational experiences of what professionalism is, right? You might find yourself, yeah, dressing a certain way on a certain day. If you know you're spending the whole day with this certain community, and it's understood that if you are dressed a certain way, that will be well received. Like I can feel that, and that's, it takes time to get to know that, right? You have to feel comfortable in yourself and who you are to be able to make those decisions on, okay, I'm intentionally going to wear or dress this or use this language today, right? Because it's also the way that we're expressing ourselves and communicating, versus, on another day, you might take a very different approach depending on who you're sitting down with. And I think these are really cool nuances. Like, thinking again, we're covering all the kind of components naturally, the nuanced relationships, but it like, these are nuances that I think for probably students and new grads, that's where you feel like you're tripping up. I would imagine. I know I felt that personally, um, but that's okay. Like, I think the biggest one is knowing that to be in relationships are complex. um you know to have any relationship and not have some level of, small c conflict at least, would be unnatural, right? Like, I think if you feel perfectly comfortable in relationship, you may not be in relationship. What do you think of that concept?
yeah, it makes me think. Recently, a friend was telling me that, we kind of have to push up against each other to know where each other are. So if
Yes.
if there's nothing to push up against, I don't know where I am in the relationship, they don't know where they are in the relationship. And so I think conflict, there's constructive, productive, even positive conflict where it's like, oh, I didn't know you felt that way. And like, there's these conversations we can have about values or beliefs, or that's not what I was saying. Like, we hear these things all the time. And I think it helps us figure out where we are and where the other person is and where the relationship is at. So I don't see it as inherently bad or negative at all.
No, and it's diving into the discomfort and being comfortable in the discomfort. And again, another theme I think this year on the podcast is it's a very colonial way of thinking, right? And in terms of wanting to remain comfortable, not wanting to press too many envelopes or rock the boat. And I think for real relationship, when we think of the truth telling, reconciliation, TRC idea, you have to be in the discomfort. It allows you to grow. It allows you to have a real connection with another person, with a community. I think you have to, there's a certain level of experimentation that needs to happen. I think like you need to, we all need to find those spaces where we can comfortably engage in trying new ideas, talking in different ways, wearing different clothing. And I do see, I really have seen that evolution, even just having students at CAOT in the last couple of years. You can really see that difference of wanting to get into the discomfort, asking the really challenging questions that I think maybe before it was seen as taboo or just not part of everyday practice, right? To just go there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm smiling because I'm just thinking about all the ways that I have leaned into the discomfort, and that our generation gets a bit of a bad reputation when it comes to um, what we're asking for and what we're pointing out as problematic. And a lot of it's about oppression of different communities and solidarity with communities who are marginalized. And to me, there's such effort put into pushing back instead of being like, oh, like let's listen here and see what side of this I'm on, where this lands for me, instead of immediately coming to it with like, oh no, that's too much change. We don't even know where to start. Kind of the like, oh, I give up mentality, instead of like, oh, that's interesting. Where can we pick away at this? Because this is a lifetime of doing this work that like a lot of us are committed to. And then, of course, it's overwhelming. But if each of us picks away at little things, that leads to bigger changes. And so I think small conflicts and leaning into discomfort, it's where the work is being done. And we see that at conference with the presentations that are now being accepted and presented. And they're not necessarily super comfortable conversations, but then they influence everybody in the room, their relationship to that idea, their relationship to the work that they do. And then that's like the ripple effect. And I personally love seeing that because it's happening for so many different topics, whether it's land back, whether it's we're talking about Palestine, we're talking about marginalized communities, we're talking about immigrants, we're talking about queerness, we're talking about trans people. I presented on trans joy at the conference to try and inject joy into discussions that are usually very deficit based. So there's so many different ways that we're pointing out like, hey, this is happening. Here's maybe something that can be your role in this as an ally or as a member. So I could go on another tangent, but I'm
Oh no, I love that. I feel, we've covered some of these concepts so naturally, like the idea of relationships, nuanced relationships, the safety piece really, this comes in a huge self-awareness aspect. I think that we've put a lot of emphasis this year on understanding what it means to engage in trauma-informed care. And I think that this piece really helps with what, like you said, Holly, moving away from the deficit piece to more of like, how are we thriving? How are we living? How are we enjoying and in partnership as allies in Indigenous communities? And it really brings, like the last one for me, this is always the one that I would say, even from day one, 2009, moving to Thunder Bay, promoting rights-based self-determination. Like this has been one that's been deep in my psyche for a long time, because this seems like it's like the ultimate peak we're trying to move towards. And encouraging, respecting the rights, strengths, and resources of the people and community, that they are in the driver's seat, that they are the ones making the decisions, and that as allies we can support that happening. And I think when you've developed that relationship, when we think of relationships as a long-term thing, then you can see that as being an objective. I think I guess I'm just thinking out loud right now, but if you're not wearing the relationship focused OT lens or approach, I think that concept of rights-based self-determination becomes very difficult, because it's like, well, that's so far from what I can do as a therapist, right? But if you're thinking I'm in relationship, and as part of the relationship, as the evolution of the relationship, this is something we're supporting and working towards, then it becomes like, oh yeah, I can see how I'm part of the story. Like I can see how we're supporting these communities to get there. And I'm curious, because I feel like BC really is leading when it comes to different Indigenous voices and communities that are really speaking up. We see a lot of examples across Canada. But what is self-determination in that sense of like, and maybe you can speak to your role or an example you've seen in terms of occupational therapy supporting that as like, this is something we can be a part of.
Yeah, I think it's a great question in terms of like what is self-determination and how does it show up? Because I think it can be hard to see when it isn't centered. It's hard to
Yeah.
actually acknowledge it. And so I think what I'm seeing, I guess the first example that comes to mind for me would be in my research, I'm trying to do more or less self-determined research, but not self being me, self being our community. So I'm part of the community that I'm researching with. And as I said earlier, even just the research questions being self-determined by the community is a huge change from how we think about research typically within an institution, where I have to, as the research leader or the primary investigator, go through the ethics process where I'm saying, these are my research questions. These are the answers that I'm going to come up with. Here's how I'm going to analyze the data. It's all about my self-determination as a researcher. And so what I'm trying to do is completely shift that to say, no, this is what we are asking. Our answers are going to be presented in this way and not in this way. Like, I'm not going to go share this information at a conference without the community saying, here's the themes. So it's a really different way of thinking about self, because for me, self can be just me, but I don't really exist. Like, I don't really exist if I'm not in relationship with other people, because every day I'm doing something with my time that's influencing my relationship with both self, but everyone else in my life. So I think that's an example that I could give.
Oh my God, I love that. And you made me think of the end product too. When you look at any PhD that's been supported by Indigenous communities, or any research paper, or any paper for that matter, the story is about the Indigenous people. The author is really a footnote. It's just like, okay, so-and-so said the following, but everything that's written down is what happened in relation to those who participated, right? And I think that, yeah, that is a huge shift. It's a shift in systems, because it's, grants, supports, ethics approval, all of that has to shift to say, okay, we are supporting, and we're seeing that happen in Canada, and it's very exciting. I'd like us to go a step further and really challenge what it means to be peer reviewed, and even who can write about different things. We still have a system where almost anybody could put together the research with any group of people. And I wonder, is that, should we all be challenged to be in relationship before engaging in that process? And I do think, anecdotally, I've seen that evolution, and certainly people can't just go and publish a paper without follow-up. It's a big requirement these days that there's, some level of knowledge translation and knowledge mobilization of the information. And essentially, if those who are part of it could benefit from the information, that it be gifted in a way that could be useful for those participants. And that's probably my last question for you on the podcast, Holly, is in relationship, and specifically with your research, what is your give back, to the community at the end of this journey? What is your kind of, and I don't think the relationship will end at that point, but it might be a natural milestone, let's say, in the relationship.
For sure, yeah. I think the first milestone was when we finished the priority setting project. That was about a year, just over a year. It was about 14 months. It was a funded project. And that was a really exciting celebration because then we had the design of the study and we celebrated it and it was really exciting. And now when the study is done, I think it'll be a continuing relationship, as you kind of alluded to there. But I think the give back to the community is the feedback that I've been hearing so far is we are so excited to have our knowledge out there taken seriously. And like it's a funded, I have a Shirk Insight Development grant for this PhD study. And like just this, the amount of funding and support for this work has been amazing because people want to hear our stories. They're going to uplift our voices. It's going to be out there in the academic world and non-academic world. So presenting it back to community and their families and something that they can take home and say, I've been part of this. Look at what we had to say about our community. Look at our joy. Look at our brilliance. Instead of me pointing out the challenges, which there absolutely are challenges, but it's not because of who we are. It's because the systems and how they oppress us. And so it's a shift in that. And so my give back to community would be, yeah, to just share our stories in ways
Oh,
that they are wanting them shared instead of the way that the institutions typically would want to say, here's why we need more money to solve all these problems, instead of saying, here's some of our issues, but here's all the ways that we're working on it.
oh, that is so beautiful. And I think it's just been such a delight chatting with you today because this is such a massive topic. I think for those who've tuned in, thank you for being part of our journey because I think relationship focused OT just or relation being in relationship is a very it's a very worthwhile discussion. It requires a lot of self-reflection personally and professionally. And I do think we are trying to push the boundaries in the profession to evolve towards this and to be able to have, occupational performance, occupational participation, being able to engage and be in relationship in different ways. And when appropriate, the relationship is the point of the therapy. And I think it's just early days in the profession, just really understanding how this can be applied. But we love to hear stories. And I love that we ended the podcast on this idea of storytelling. So for anyone who's listening today and you want to share a story about what relationship focused therapy means for you, we'd love to attach it to the podcast. And Holly, any last words for our listeners before we sign off?
For the listeners, I think just thanks for listening and engaging with this. Yeah, I would love always open to feedback, discussion. I don't know if you're going to share emails or anything like that in the description, but happy to connect further, of course. And thank you again for having me on. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you today, Justine.
We will for sure. Holly, if you do not know Holly, definitely connect you to Holly. Holly is also on LinkedIn, and we'll make sure to have a resource if you have anything you're willing to share at this point. I know you're still in the midst of your PhD, but we can certainly attach it to the podcast episode. And I think some of our listeners would definitely be inspired by what you shared today in terms of how you've experienced it. So thank you, everyone. And we look forward to having you on the podcast, hopefully not in 3 years from now, but
Yeah.
again in the future.
Yeah, that would be lovely. Thanks again.